4 or 5 years back, I went through an experience with something that I can't exactly explain. I know many people out there go through different things in life, but this one really stands out to me. There are so many that would have gone through what I've gone through with trauma and not being able to go back into the wilderness, but for me, it was more of a wake-up call to the open-minded and to be alert to all things that we don't know about. I had no idea this would happen to me, and I ventured into this place not knowing exactly what I would get myself into. Back in the late summer, I would usually go and hike and venture around in the swamps and Everglades of Florida, all the way up into the swamps and bayous of Louisiana. There's just something about the thick, swampy humidity that just draws me in. I absolutely love the wildlife and the thrill and rush of being around so many dangerous and poisonous animals. I know many might call me crazy by saying that, but it puts you on edge and makes you have an alertness to things and noises around you that you wouldn't normally have. I've camped alone by myself in the Everglades and all through the swamp for years, for weeks at a time. I feel like it's only made me a hardier individual. Doing what I do isn't for everybody, and it certainly is an incredibly hard feat at times. The scorching heat and high levels of humidity are enough to make many novice to moderate explorers tap out. That also doesn't include things like water moccasins, poisonous insects and snakes, alligators, and terrain so thick you can hardly get through. I think that's why it draws me in so much, because it presents itself as such a challenge that I want to conquer. Anyway, I don't want to bore you with irrelevant details. I just want listeners to know that many don't go out trotting through this type of environment for long. I feel like that's the only reason I experienced what I did, is because I put myself in that environment for the time that I did. Had I only gone for a day or two, I don't believe I would be walking away the same person. I want to say this happened in August of 2014 or possibly 2015. I was deep in the swamps somewhere right around the border of Louisiana, and I can't exactly remember the spot, but I was in there deep. There were certainly parts of the swamp that I traversed through that were so thick you needed a very sharp machete or some sort of thick cutting tool to even make your way in or around. The first major component that I had encountered was what I believed to be a den or a hole or possibly a tunnel that these things lived in. After coming to an area in which it was clear man had not ventured into because of the density of brush and thickness, swamp-like conditions, I had to work to pave my way in. I put myself in harm's way in the name of exploration, venturing into unknown dangerous waters with reptiles that could easily take me out. It's not like I wasn't vulnerable at all. Many would call me foolish for doing such things, but like I said earlier, there's just something about the thrill of it. I lost track of how much time I put into cutting my way through the thick overgrowth of swamp, but came to a small patch of land that looked to be beveled out in the ground with what appeared to be a finely dug hole. This looked to be like a well-constructed entrance to a cave or something, but you could tell it wasn't naturally occurring. The problem is, this hole was around 7 feet tall, if I had to guess, but was more narrow. I know for a fact it was taller than me, because I'm 5'11". There is no known animals in the swamp that would make this hole this way, nor any animals that come close to the size. This got me very intrigued, but I wasn't about to go stick myself in a dugout entrance to a cave without any light or proper equipment. The swamps is one thing, but that's venturing into spelunking, into a potential den of a dangerous animal. Boy, was I proven right. After being fascinated and spending a small time observing the entrance, curious as to what would create it, I started getting this feeling. I really started to get the feeling that I shouldn't be there. It's as if my senses were screaming at me that a large predator would be coming out or possibly approaching. I'm no stranger to those feelings, having encountered multiple mountain lions and even mama bears with cubs in the past. I wasn't about to blow off my gut instinct. It's something I respect and always listen to. I quickly continued on and thought nothing of it. Made it about another half day to a spot in even denser wilderness that I was able to set up and make a tiny camp. Tiny camp being my one-person tent and a small cot. The nighttime is where things get really out of hand, and the following day. I was able to make a camp spot in a little cutaway spot in the brush that suited well for where I'd sleep. It was already getting dusk, so I began sitting at my one-person tent, like I just said. I laid on my small cot with my small 9mm by my side. I always kept that thing with me, no matter where I go. Yeah, it might not do great in every situation, but some protection is better than nothing, and a bullet will serve me far better than a rusty old knife ever will. My thoughts at the time were focused on where I was going to the following day, and what part of the swamp I would want to make my way through. I must have been in intensive thought, because at some point or another, I had fallen asleep, totally unaware of my exhaustion of the day. I had totally forgotten all about finding that hole earlier, and feeling the sensation of doom following it. I'm not exactly sure if my senses woke me up or what happened, but my consciousness flicked on with my eyes still closed. You know how it is. I quickly was alerted to something heavy and large approaching my tent from in the brush. It was slow at first, but it became heavier the closer it came to my tent. My mind was racing to come up with an answer on what this could be. Approaching from the thick, swampy brush, I didn't feel fear as I was perplexed on what exactly I was hearing. That's when I was able to make out that what I was hearing was something bipedal and not on 4 feet like an animal or a bear. Whatever I was hearing was creeping up to my tent and intentionally trying to be quiet and sneaky from the brush with 2 footsteps for each stride. I thought it to be a person coming to rob me at first, and my thoughts quickly turned to fear as I realized that no human was heavy enough to create footsteps that loudly. Whatever this was came in on my tent fast, and before I could even think, I could feel the presence of somebody or something right outside my tent. The air around me quickly grew incredibly tense. I quickly reached for my handgun, which I keep loaded at any given moment. As I'm reaching for my weapon, I see this claw, or what I believe to be a claw, begin to press itself so hard into the tent wall, it ripped right through. Bursting through my tent wall was a large black-like claw. My mind immediately went to the velociraptors in the Jurassic Park movies. Those big black raptor claws. That's exactly what it looks like. But I didn't think about that in the moment. I grab a hold of my gun and steadily flip the safety off. As I'm turning my arm towards this unknown intruder, this claw begins to shred all the way down and my tent into pieces, just dragging all the way down the wall, leaving a gaping hole. Before I could finish pulling the claw out, I fired one good shot, and the scream that I heard after, it was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. This thing wasn't a human, and it certainly wasn't any animal I'd ever come to know. I can't even begin to tell you or describe to you the sound of what this scream sounded like. It was horrible. Whatever it was took off in the opposite direction, crashing through the brush rather quickly. It must have been really large, because the crashing sound was immense and powerful. It had fled even faster than when it had descended upon my tent the first time. It had torn such a long hole through my tent wall that I was literally able to jump out of my cot and step outside of my tent for the first time to chase my assailant, but it was far too dark to see anything. I think in the moment I was just so pumped full of adrenaline that I wasn't even taking into consideration what it was that even did try to come into my tent, because I feel most sane human beings wouldn't be chasing after whatever the hell this thing was with a 9mm pistol. I don't think I was standing outside trying to let my eyes adjust to the darkness for more than a moment, trying to listen, when I started hearing more and more thudding coming in my direction. I was able to make out in just seconds that thudding were more heavy footsteps. I jumped back in my tent, grabbed my flashlight, and shined it in the general direction that I heard the thudding. Same direction that the first one came in. I'm assuming whatever it was that I shot, or whoever it was coming back, and I was going to end it for good. I'm not a murderer by any means, but if it's a matter of me or you, well, sorry. I wasn't going to die out here all alone in the swamp. I'd shown my light, and the first thing I saw were these deep red, reptilian-looking eyes, followed by a body crashing through the brush, heading right for me. Now, I realized a couple things in that moment. Not only did I have full view of whatever the hell I was looking at, but I realized for the first time that there's more to this world than we could ever come to realize, whether we enjoy it or not. I don't think my brain really took more than a couple of seconds to process what it was I was looking at, because I don't think I really ever fully processed it. I just started firing round after round like a madman into whatever this thing that was approaching me. Let me give you some more details real quick. This thing was taller than me, so probably 7 to 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark, gangly looking green scales with some lighter scales on the front of its body. This thing was walking bipedally and had a large reptilian looking head. It actually to me looked very crocodilian, with large teeth protruding at its top and bottom jaws and deep red reptilian eyes. It almost looked to me like you combined a person with a crocodile and maybe a iguana. I don't mean like those glowing fake red eyes though that you hear in monster stories. These were just natural reptilian eyes, but they were a deep crimson. This was obviously some sort of humanoid reptilian being that I must have pissed off somehow, because it looked mad, and it was coming right for me. After firing off a couple of shots, it disappeared into the dark. I realized then that there were more than just one, and I jumped back into my tent with my gun clasped tightly, ready for war. I was so pumped full of adrenaline. I don't think I was really comprehending exactly what was going on, and that I needed to survive, and that I was being attacked by some large swamp animal. The swamp stayed dead silent around me, and I heard no more sounds for the next few hours as I stayed up, awake and alert, and ready for anything. Day started to break at some point, and I think I caught myself nodding off out of sheer exhaustion and being pumped so full of adrenaline the night before. I didn't have a watch or any way to tell time on me, so I'm not exactly sure what time in the morning that little encounter happened. All I know is daylight came and I got my stuff together, my now tattered tent, useless, and my cot, and I tried to get out of there as quick as I could. And don't worry, I kept my pistol at the ready. I decided to keep going in the direction I was originally planning, and that would take me out of the thicket of the swamp. I don't think it was more than an hour later that I encountered another clear area in the swamp with yet another large hole like I found the day before. It looked exactly the same with the same artificial looking entrance that looked dug out. What was even more disturbing is all around the hole with soft mud were these incredibly large reptilian footprints of something that looked bipedal, at least the way it walked did. These were massive prints, far bigger than my hand, and the indent was at least an inch deep. Of course, I had nothing to cast these footprints with, nor take a picture with, but for the first time this whole trip, I actually felt spooked because what I dealt with last night was a reality. And in that moment, I pieced it together that whatever it was I had encountered last night must have been whatever was traveling or living in these tunnels. Some sort of large swamp reptilian beings. This hole had a smell too. It was a mixture of death, blood, and swamp rot. I didn't spend any time hanging around other than to look at the tracks and traverse out of there, and I tried to make my way further away from this whole area that I regret now going into. It took me the rest of the day to get back to an area where there was at least some civilization, a lone road possibly, being able to hitchhike back to real civilization. I didn't really tell anybody what happened to me or my story because I didn't really think it would be appropriate. What happens in the swamp stays in the swamp, and I just figured that I had encountered some sort of creature that had been undiscovered in the swamp and had been left alone by man, forgotten in the thick Everglades. What I didn't know is that there is such thing as reptilian beings, these 8 to 9 foot tall bipedal reptilian carnivores. My speculation is that maybe the first time I had encountered one of their tunnels, they were in an area or could smell me and didn't like that I had discovered their hole, which is the reason why they followed me and tracked me down to where I had bedded down at. As frightening as this whole experience was, I have never let it stop me from continually exploring and going back into the swamps to the areas where I love to go. I just have to accept there's more than meets the eye, and I need to be aware of my surroundings to every degree. The area of swamp that I traversed into was thick and very hard to get into. As I was cutting my way into the thick brush, I could see why many, if none at all, had not traveled into it. This was miles and miles in, traversing through thick brush and questionable bogs and areas of water where there could have been alligators and such. I don't think the way anybody would go so far back, which was why I was brave enough to do it, even if it meant putting myself in danger and being extremely vulnerable. It makes sense now from an animal's perspective why they would have some sort of den back there, without the worry or fear of being disturbed by humans. But at the same time, I set myself up for being way too vulnerable. For anybody out there who's an avid explorer like me, and goes to the areas where nobody else goes, you need to be aware that there might be things that you don't like that live out there, and that you might be encroaching on the territory. This is why it's important to have respect for the wilderness and the things around you, and it is vital, but take caution and take heed. I would like to think that I share the swamp with every other being. Unfortunately, I don't share the swamp with friendly neighbors, so to speak, and that I guess there are some things that just wish to remain hidden. There's a lot of things that come out of the desert that I don't quite understand, even if it's the situations that I myself was put in. I'm half Navajo and know all about skinwalkers and the legends that part of my people have passed down for years and years. Because I am half Navajo, I have always had a lot of friends and family that were richly immersed in the Navajo culture and lifestyle, while a lot of my other family and friends were just regular people. I consider myself extremely blessed to be able to experience both walks of life and cultures. I have even had encounters with such beings before, but that is for another time and place. What I'm talking to you about today is something that is far beyond my understanding, and something my people never talked about to my knowledge. I was out late at night once, past the reservation on my way back. I had just gotten done partying with a couple of friends, and we were doing a late night drive. I should note at this time that nobody in the vehicle, including the driver, was intoxicated or not sober in any way. This also includes me. We were just really needing some fresh air and to get out, and there's nothing like Arizona nighttime air. We're driving down the road, and we're the only ones that we could see around us. If anybody has ever driven out here at night, you would know that it is pitch black, except for the stars above you, that only offer little light, and the moon occasionally. My buddy was doing about 70 or 75 miles an hour, when out of the darkness, over a ridge to our left, flying towards our vehicle, was this large lizard-like creature. It was running on all fours, but it looked strange, like it was forced. It would be like making a human run on all fours. It was awkward looking, and you can tell that they don't normally or didn't normally run like that. This thing had protruding spines and scales all over its back, and little horns to be what was aligned on its shoulder blade, all the way down to its buttocks. And it was scaly, and it was almost a smoky charcoal color. It nearly collided with our car as it got close. It outstretched its arm and slashed at the left front tire, causing it to go flat immediately, and we almost nearly crashed off the road. All of us in the car are screaming bloody murder and going crazy, while my friend is trying to stabilize the car and floor it at the same time on a flat tire. The impact of this thing slashing the tire did so much damage to the car that it nearly took us off the road. As my friend is trying to floor the car on a shredded tire and also regain stability of the vehicle, we hear this loud metal clashing sound from the engine. That meant his transmission went out. Now he was no longer able to accelerate, and he was forced to slowly glide and come down to a stop in the middle of the road at night. I think we all just sat there screaming our heads off, freaking out, not knowing what to do. My two friends in the back weren't Navajo at all. They were just regular high school kids that we had partied with. And after a minute, I think we were able to collect ourselves enough to have somebody trying to make a phone call to get somebody to come pick us up. The only person we knew, unfortunately, was my friend's father, and he was an abusive alcoholic. So he pulls out his phone and proceeds to call his father to come pick him up and let him know that our car broke down, purposefully not mentioning that we were just attacked and chased off the road by some large demon lizard thing. His dad says he will be there in about 20 minutes or shorter, and for us to sit tightly. My friend, who is a full-blooded Navajo, just starts praying in Navajo, while my other friends and I are freaking out still, expecting this thing to show itself and kill us all. It was incredibly eerie, sitting there waiting for his dad to show up, knowing that this thing was just a little ways away in the darkness, surrounding us, waiting for the right moment to get us. At least that's how it felt. But nothing happened. We just sat there in the car, alone, with the night around us, silent, expecting something to happen. That's when we saw headlights show up over the horizon. After some time, and lo and behold, it was his father to come save us. Like I said earlier, I was never a huge fan of his father personally, because he was an abusive alcoholic, but that was probably the one and only time I'd ever been happy to see him. We all piled in the car without him even getting a chance to see the car and the condition that it was in. And even though we never said anything about what we saw, I knew that we couldn't be happier to be rescued. For whatever reason, whatever it was we saw never tried to attack us more than once, and once our car was on the side of the road, it seemed like it just left us alone. I'm not exactly sure why. Could it possibly because my friend was praying in Navajo? I don't know. But I think the bigger question remains is what exactly did we see, and why did it attack our vehicle? This thing was huge, and must have had an immense force to use its claws to slash a tire open with one strike. When his dad pulled up, since it was dark out, we really didn't give him a chance to see what happened and only told him. It wasn't until the following morning we all came back to retrieve the car and get it towed that his father saw the damage to the tire for the first time. I remember his expression and him kneeling down to look at the huge gash to the tire and sternly looking at my friend saying, "Son, what really happened here?" You can tell he was concerned and knew something had happened. And no, it wasn't that we drove over a broken bottle. He knew. That's when my friend finally told him what had happened, quietly. His father had hugged him, something I hadn't seen him do in the entire amount of years that I had known them, and spoke something to him quietly in his ear, in Navajo that I couldn't quite make out. Apparently, not only had his transmission gone out randomly, but we had been attacked by something none of us even knew existed. At least with skinwalkers, they're in our culture. We know about them. We know ways to protect ourselves from them and to stay away. There is no preparing any of us for this creature. I'm not sure if it was a creature of the desert or a creature of the night, but either way, it's just another nightmare to try and avoid now. Maybe many of the older Navajo around here don't speak of other such things because it's true that if you speak about it, it will draw them to you. Could this be true for what we encountered? Or were we simply marked and attacked by something more sinister and evil? About 12 to 15 years ago, I used to do some missionary work for a church that I was a part of, in which I got to visit a lot of the world, and for that, I'm forever thankful. I learned a lot and grew a lot as a person, but what's even more remarkable is some of the stories that I got to hear from some of these people in villages. This particular story that I'm going to share with you was from a man from one of the villages in Eastern Africa. Forgive me because I can't remember the country. His English, though, was actually pretty good for being a native and for how primitive he lived. He would tell me things about creatures of the night attacking their village and taking their young children down into the rivers and drowning them and eating them. He explained that these demons were crocodilian-looking creatures with long lizard-like heads and snouts, and sometimes eating the children whole before taking them back into the river. He went on to tell me that even river crocodiles and the hippopotamus would fear these humanoid beings, and that they would only enter into the village at nighttime. They had constructed several religious wards to try and rid these beings from entering, but they didn't work. More than a dozen of the village's children had been taken over the last several years. Warriors and men alike of the village had put together a little hunting party to travel into or close to the river as possible, to seek these beings out, to hunt and to kill. They've been able to kill a couple, but more men have died from fighting these things than they've been able to kill, so there was a retreat. Some of these same men faced vicious repercussions of attacks, with severed arms and other miscellaneous chunks of flesh taken out of their body. These men look like they've been attacked by river crocodiles, but have actually only had fights with whatever these beings were. I was even told that sometimes when these beings come to abduct young children, that they will kill them right there on the spot and ripping them into pieces, biting off portions and limbs of their body. When I asked him to clarify more on what these lizard-like beings were, he told me that they were tall and scrawny with very long arms. Some were pale, some were darker, and some were almost black. They have these long claws at the end of their fingers and have huge, sharp dinosaur-like teeth. When I asked about their face, he explained that their snout was kind of sloped downward, and that the snout was extremely long, reminiscent to that of a caiman. Their eyes will glow a natural yellow, and they have an emanation of evil from them. You hardly ever see them on land, and they only come out of the water or the river at night. When they drag children away, it's to drown them into the river and pull them down to where they are. The man said and thought to be that the children were drowned and stuck underneath the bed at the bottom of the river, kind of like how a crocodile does once it death rolls its prey and stores its body in the soft silted mud underneath for later. But nobody knows for sure. So far, no one has been brave enough to try and swim down into the river to try and find them, or to know exactly where these things are coming from. Now, I need to clarify that personally, I never saw any of these beings or any of this myself, since this was just a village we were passing through for the day, shortly. But him and several other villagers I spoke to seemed downright terrified, and only verified even more with what he told me, the more and more I spoke to villagers. Mothers would be panicked at me just bringing the topic up, and would keep their children locked away inside and hidden, with men carrying crude weapons around them at all time. Same with the women, which was actually shocking to see most mothers carrying around some sort of spear or dagger. I wish I could remember the word they used to call these things, but it basically meant crocodile people in their language, or so I was told. Honestly, that will always and forever stick with me, because it literally chilled me to the bone